Mrs Frisby and the Rats of NIMH by Robert C. O'Brien. Chapter 1. The Sickness of Timothy Frisby. Mrs Frisby, the head of a family of field mice, lived in an underground house in the vegetable garden of a farmer named Mr Fitzgibbon. It was a winter house such as some field mice move to when food becomes too scarce and the living too hard in the woods and pastures. In the soft earth of a bean, potato, black-eyed pea, and asparagus patch there is plenty of food left over for mice after the human crop has been gathered. Mrs Frisby and her family were especially lucky in the house itself. It was a slightly damaged cinder block, the hollow kind with two oval holes through it. It had somehow been abandoned in the garden during the summer and lay almost completely buried, with only a bit of one corner showing above ground, which is how Mrs Frisby had discovered it. It lay on its side in such a way that the solid parts of the block formed a roof and a floor, both waterproof, and the hollows made two spacious rooms. Lined with bits of leaves, grass, cloth, cotton, fluff, feathers, and other soft things Mrs Frisby and her children had collected, the house stayed dry, warm, and comfortable all winter. A tunnel to the surface earth of the garden, dug so that it was slightly larger than a mouse and slightly smaller than a cat's foreleg, provided access, air, and even a fair amount of light to the living room. The bedroom, formed by the second oval, was warm but dark even at midday. A short tunnel through the earth behind the block connected the two rooms. Although she was a widower, her husband had died only the preceding summer. Mrs Frisby was able, through luck and hard work, to keep her family, their 4 children, happy and well fed. January and February were the hardest months. The sharp, hard cold that began in December lasted until March, and by February the beans and black-eyed peas had been picked over, with help from the birds, the asparagus roots were frozen into stones, and the potatoes had been thawed and refrozen so many times that they had acquired a slimy texture and a rancid taste. Still, the Frisbys made with the best of what there was, and one way or another they kept from being hungry. Then, one day at the very end of February, Mrs Frisby's younger son, Timothy, fell sick. That day began with a dry, bright, icy morning. Mrs Frisby woke up early, as she always did. She and her family slept close together in a bed of down, fluff, and bits of cloth they had gathered, warm as a ball of fur. She stood up carefully as to not awaken the children, and walked quietly through the short tunnel to the living room. Here it was not so warm, but not really cold either. She could see from the light filtering down the entrance tunnel that the sun was up and bright. She looked at the food in her pantry, a hollowed-out space lined with small stones in the earth behind the living room. There was plenty of food for breakfast and lunch and dinner too, for that matter, but still the sight depressed her, for it was the same tiresome fare they had been eating every day, every meal, for the last month. She wished she knew where to find a bit of green lettuce, or a small egg, or a taste of cheese, or a corn muffin. There were eggs in plenty not far off, in the hen-house, but hens and hens' eggs are too big for a field mouse to cope with, and besides, between the garden and the hen-house there was a wide sward of shrubs and grass, some of it grown up quite tall. Cat territory. She climbed up the tunnel, emerging whiskers first, and looked around warily. The air was sharp, and there was a white frost thick on the ground and on the dead leaves at the edge of the wood across the garden patch. Mrs Frisby set off over the gently furrowed earth, and when she reached the fence she turned right, skittering around the border of the forest, searching with her bright round eyes for a bit of carrot, a frozen parsnip, or something green. But there was nothing green at that time of year but the needles on the pine trees and the leaves on the holly, neither of which a mouse, or any other animal, for that matter, can eat. And then, straight in front of her, she did see something green. She had reached the far corner of the garden, and there, at the edge of the wood, At the edge of the woods, where it met the fence, there was a stump. In the stump there was a hole, and out of the hole protruded something that looked a little like a leaf, but was not. Mrs. Frisby had no trouble at all going through the cattle wire fence, but she approached the hole cautiously. If the stump was hollow, as it seemed to be, there was no telling who or what might be living in it. A foot or so from the hole she stopped, stood still, and watched and listened. She could hear no sound, but from there she could see what the grain was. It was, in fact, a yellowish-brownish grain, a bit of corn shuck. But what was a corn shuck doing there? The cornfield was in a different part of the farm altogether, away beyond the pasture. Mrs. Frisby hopped closer and then carefully crept up the side of the stump and peered inside. When her eyes got used to the dark, she saw that she had found a treasure, a winter's supply of food carefully stored and then, for some reason, forgotten or abandoned. But stored by whom? A raccoon, perhaps? Not very likely, so far from the stream. More likely a squirrel or a groundhog. She knew that both of these felt free to help themselves to the new corn each year, and that they were strong enough to carry ears away and store them. But whoever had done it, and why had he then abandoned the store? And then she remembered. Back in November there had come from near the edge of the wood the sound that sends all of the animals in the forest shivering to their hiding places, the sound of a hunter's guns shooting, the sound that is accompanied by someone for a fiery stabbing pain, and then he never needs his food store again. Still, since Mrs. Frisby did not even know what kind of animal it had been, much less his name, she could not shed many tears over him. And food was food. It was not the green lettuce she had longed for, but she and her children were extremely fond of corn, and there were 8 large ears in the stump, a noble supply for a mouse family. Down under the corn she also could see a pile of fresh peanuts from still another part of the farm, some hickory nuts, and a stack of dried, sweet-smelling mushrooms. With her forepaws and sharp teeth she pulled off a part of the husk from the top ear of corn and folded it double to serve as a crude carrying bag. Then she pulled loose as many of the yellow kernels she could easily fit, and putting them in the shuck bag she hopped briskly off for home. She would come back for more after breakfast and bring the children to help. She backed down the tunnel entrance to her house, tail first, pulling the corn after her and calling cheerfully as she went, "Children, wake up! See what I have for breakfast! A surprise!" They came hurrying out, rubbing their eyes in excitement, for any kind of surprise in food was a rare and festive thing in the cold dead of winter. Teresa, the oldest, came first. Crowding close behind her was Martin, the biggest, a strong, quick mouse, dark-haired and handsome like his poor father. And then came Cynthia, the youngest, a slim, pretty girl mouse, light-haired and, in fact, a little light-headed as well, and over-fond of dancing. "Where is it?" she said. What is it? Where's the surprise?" "Where is Timothy?" Mrs. Frisby asked. "Mother," said Teresa, concerned, "he says he's sick and can't get up."